Have you ever wanted to be able to control what objects get created in a specific size or style to control cost across an enterprise? This is part of the governance and control module inside of our Azure AZ-104 course. My name is Bob Tickleman. I'm excited to be your guide for this module specifically on how to create and enforce Azure policies. When you take a look at an Azure policy, it is a way to enforce governance at the creation of objects and on an ongoing basis. So I want to talk a bit about this in a whiteboard session. I'm going to come back and show you these pieces as we get into the slides, and then I'll do some live demos of this. Now, this is a view that a lot of people don't typically see of Azure. And what you're taking a look at here is the hierarchical structure of the physical infrastructure of Azure. We have a thing called the ARM layer, or the Azure Resource Manager. Now, this is a bit of a kind of play on words because you'll see in other recordings of a term called bicep, which is a way to deploy something. And if you take a look at a bicep on an arm, it's a way to flex it. And in fact, I'll use that reference when I get to show you how to use bicep. But know that regardless of how you interact with Azure, whether it be through the portal, the graphical UI that I've been using in these demonstrations, whether it be through templates, whether it be through PowerShell, CLI, or the SDKs, these are all methods to interact with Azure, but they all have to come through this ARM layer. So if you wanted to create, even say, a virtual machine, they would have to come somehow through the ARM layer to pass through the ARM layer to actually get down into what are called resource providers. A virtual machine would need a storage resource provider, a compute resource provider, a network resource provider. It might need a memory resource provider. All of these resource providers are your avenue to the actual resources that would be deployed on the physical infrastructure that we've talked about in another recording where we showed you Azure regions and availability zones, all of those pieces. But to deploy a virtual machine, you have to come through the ARM layer. Depending on which region you're deploying, we have thousands of different SKUs, everything from 1 core and a half a gig of memory up to VMs that have 700 cores and 12 terabytes of virtual machines. Now, maybe I don't want someone deploying a 700 core, 12 terabytes worth of RAM VM, so I need to put some governance around that. And where I'm going to do that is through the ARM layer by creating a thing called a policy. A policy becomes a filter through anything that you're trying to work with inside of Azure, and you must pass the compliance of the policy to be able to deploy it. I'm going to be doing an example later on where maybe you can say I can only deploy VMs up to a specific SKU size that you're working with for dev and test so that they don't over provision those resources. So all of these can control a series of components. Now, it's not really talked a lot about in the class, but I do want to mention some of those policies right now because let's say you deployed a virtual machine, and that virtual machine currently has 24 cores and 128 gigs of RAM. You've already been deployed, it's running in Azure, and all of a sudden now you have a new policy that says you must have no more than 8 cores and you must have no more than 64 gigabytes of RAM. That's the new policy. What's going to happen? They talk about it a little bit in the books. You might want to dive deeper into the learning on the content in the Microsoft Learn site and in the product documentation. A policy can be enforced, it can be set to audit, it could be set to modify, different ways to deploy the actions that the policy is going to be taking. But I just want to describe something to you right now. So a resource that's already been deployed that doesn't meet the access components of a policy, if you try and change that resource, so you have another user who's trying to access that resource and maybe they want to add some more cores, it's not going to stop this VM from running by default, but it will now say if you want to make any changes to this VM, you're going to have to now bring it into compliance to make any changes to it at all. That's the default handling, but there's all sorts of different ways to change that. As I suggest, go take a look at the documentation to see what your specific needs are. So you can build these policies to make them as simple or as complex as you need them to be, to enforce governance at the resource deployment and running across the entire surface of resources available inside of Azure. So when you take a look at policies, what they can be used for, as I said, deploying types of resources to limit them down. In a previous recording, we talked about having tags. Maybe you want to have a tag put on a resource. So regardless if it's a type of resource, I need to maybe have the type of resource for production versus test. Maybe I have a type of resource that is going to put in a cost center. Maybe it gives you an option to actually give me the cost center. All sorts of ways that you can enforce the policies and say, add if they doesn't one exist. So if someone puts a cost center in that maybe changes the default, that's great. But if they don't put one on, it's going to deploy it and give it a default cost center if you wanted to. So a lot of different ways to enforce a governance on the creation and ongoing use of the objects themselves using this concept called a policy. Now, when I do the demonstration, and you'll see this a bit in the slides, a policy is a JSON document that describes the object that you want to control and the types of controls you want to put around the object. So that's pretty simple. So you create a policy and you deploy it to a scope. And the scopes inside of Azure are at the tenant level, the management group level, the subscription level, the resource group level, and the resources. So if you have a policy that you deploy at a subscription level, that bills a cost center to that subscription by default, that would then apply to all resources that deploy below that subscription, because that's the scope, and it's one of the objects that gets inherited by the child objects. A policy typically controls a single attribute around the deployment of something. You might have multiple resources that need to be deployed in conjunction. And this is where you have this hierarchy of not just policies, but a thing called an initiative. So you can take one or more policies, put it inside of an initiative, and then deploy that initiative, and then all of the policies that have been assigned to that initiative would then be deployed to the assignment of the scope in which that initiative was deployed. So what we now have is this hierarchical structure that if you have one or more policies that need to be applied to a scope, and remember the scopes are at the tenant level, the management group level, parent to child, through the subscription level, through the resource group level, and then the resources. So wherever scope you apply it, the policy would apply in that downstream. It's one of the objects that does get inherited, much like your capability like locks. And we saw that in a previous recording, tags don't get inherited. And that's one reason why you might have a policy to enforce a tagging on resources because they are not inherited. Now, when you take a look at a grouping of one or more, I can have a grouping of policies inside of initiative. So instead of deploying 5 or 6 different policies, I can deploy them as a collective group and put them out. And I'll be doing a demonstration in a bit that takes a look at policies like GDPR, the General Data Protection Rules in Europe, HIPAA regulations in the United States, as well as other ones. Microsoft has created a set of policies and initiatives that meet these standard governance requirements for control of objects. And we'll show you how to use that, as I said, in that demonstration. I'm back in the portal, and with most things in here, several ways to get to them. In the upper left-hand corner, I've got the hamburger menu. You might be able to find it there as a pre-built object that you've created. You can search for the word policy, in this case, or whatever the object is you're looking for, and it should come up as a pop-up list. And if you've gone to it recently, it may actually be on the most recently accessed services. So I'm in the policy blade that I now am going to be able to work with the deployments of the various policies and initiatives. So I'm going to take a look at the definitions, and we're going to see that we have several hundred pre-built as both the policy and the initiative level. If I just scroll to the bottom of this list, you'll see that I've got a little over 3,396 at the time of this recording of both policies and initiatives. And you can see we've got some that are static, which means that they can't change. The built-in ones are built by Microsoft and managed that you could then copy. Now I'm going to change the definition type and just sort it a different way. I'm actually going to search for GDPR. You'll see that GDPR, the General Data Protection Rules, the European regulation, has been built as an initiative, and it's made up of 285 different policies. So if I click on it, you can see the individual policies that are controlling the initiative itself. And as I said, these are government regulations for the European Union. Microsoft has created these on your behalf that you could then deploy to specific scopes that would then force those rules to be enforced on the objects that are created from that object down through the hierarchy to its child objects. And remember that if the objects have already been created, by default, it will flag them as non-compliant objects. It won't force them to come into compliance. You could potentially change that behavior, but by default is just to audit them. You could then get an audit report. You could then send a note to the people to say, hey, these objects are not in compliance. You need to have them in compliance by a specific date. And you could then enforce the policy as of that date if they haven't been brought into compliance. Now I can actually manage these. Several ways to create them. I could create a policy or initiative. I could create, in this case, the initiative and then select the one or more policies that I want to be part of it. Once I've created either the policy or the initiative, cancel out of here, I then go to the assignments, which then assigns it to the scope in which you want it to apply. So you can see a number of these are at the different subscription levels. Some are done at the tenant root. And so you can deploy either the policy or initiative at those different levels. So once the policies have been deployed, you can get reporting on, and you see some reports that are inside of the portal itself, where I can see which ones are compliant, which ones are not. And these are all drill through reports. So I can drill through on the policy compliance. So now looking at that compliance report, we've got a number of Kusto queries that you could actually put in, or you've got some drop-down boxes to do that same level of filtering. But I can now take a look at, I've got an Azure security baseline. It was configured at the tenant root. The compliance is not compliant. I've got 54%, or 27 out of a number of the machines. So I can drill through, find out what the policy is, and actually which devices are not compliant. So I've got network security, data protection. So these are different policies inside of the initiative. You can go in and take a look at which ones they are specifically. And then you can take a look at the actual devices that are not compliant so that you can remediate them. So with that, we've taken a look at Azure policies as a way to enforce governance at the enterprise level across your entire tenant by either creating policies, individual controls, or groups of them using initiatives to deploy them to a scope to have a variety of different actions deployed to them. I would encourage you to look at the documentation that talks about, by default, they are going to be in an audit configuration that will just warn you that those objects are not in compliant, or you can enforce, you can add if not modified, or if none exist. There's a whole different set of ways that you can actually have the policy enforced. Thanks for joining us for this session. To continue your learning, watch other videos in the course or explore more on Microsoft Learn at aka.ms/learn.